My father looked me in the eyes and said, "You are no longer my son." I was 24 years old, the entire plantation in ashes behind me, and the only thing I knew was that I hadn't done it. It took me 20 years to return, and when I returned, it wasn't for revenge. It was to save the same land that had expelled me. Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do? Have you ever felt the weight of a silence that wasn't yours, but that you carried as if it were? Today I'm going to tell you the story of Ezequiel, a man who lost his family because of a lie, and who had to return home so that the truth could finally find its place. Come with me, and I'll tell you this story in the Valley of the Palms. Surrounded by coffee plantations that stretched as far as the eye could see, Norberto's family was known for 3 generations of hard work on the land. His grandfather had cleared that piece of ground when it was still dense forest, and his father had expanded the property until it became the largest coffee production in the region. Norberto had inherited not only the land, but the weight of keeping the family name alive before the entire valley. He was a man of few words, with thick hands and a tired gaze. Widowed since Dana Miletina died while still young, leaving 2 sons to raise alone. Norberto had learned to hide any sign of weakness behind work. He didn't know how to say words of affection, but he showed love every day, getting up before sunrise to ensure his sons would have the opportunity for a better life than his own. Ezequiel, the eldest, was already 24 years old at that time, and was his father's right-hand man in managing the farm. A soft-spoken, studious man, he had taught himself to read about modern cultivation techniques in borrowed books, dreaming of further expanding the family's production with methods he saw working in other regions. He was respected by the workers, loved by the neighbors, and saw in the land not just a business, but a heritage that needed to be cared for with affection. Adao, the younger brother, was 19 years old and was different from his brother in almost everything. Restless, impulsive, always seeking adventure and easy recognition. He kept getting into trouble from which only his older brother could get him out. He admired Ezequiel with that mixture of love and envy that only exists between brothers, wanting to be as respected as him, but without the patience necessary to earn that respect in the same way. On the night when everything changed, Ada had gotten involved, hidden from his father, in a risky loan deal with a man from outside the valley, in an attempt to raise quick money to pay a gambling debt that had already been dragging on for months. To get the deadline he needed, he had promised part of that year's harvest as collateral, without anyone's authorization, and he hid from his father and brother the size of the mess he had gotten himself into. In the early morning when the loan deadline expired, Ada went to the barn where the entire harvest was stored, determined to take part of it hidden before his father noticed, in a desperate attempt to negotiate more time with the creditor. He carried a lantern to see in the dark, and it was a brusque movement, a stumble among the stacked sacks that knocked the flame onto the dry straw around it. The fire caught quickly, fueled by the strong wind on that June night. In minutes, the flames rose high enough to be seen from the main house. Norberto and the workers ran with buckets of water, but it was too late. The barn burned for hours, consuming not only the harvest, but a good part of the structure built by Ezequiel's grandfather decades earlier. When the fire finally died down, at dawn, only smoke rising from the charred wood remained, and the bitter smell of burnt coffee hung over the entire property. It was at that moment, with his face dirty with soot and his body trembling with fear, that Ada, terrified at the possibility of his father discovering the hidden debt and the bad deal with the creditor, pointed his finger at his older brother, who had just arrived running from the other side of the property. "It was him, father. I saw him messing around in the barn with a lantern before the fire started." It was a lie born of panic, of the fear of admitting the debt and the hidden deal, of the shame of revealing to his father the extent of his own Edoe knew, deep down, that he was wrong, but the fear at that moment spoke louder than any loyalty. Ezequiel stood paralyzed, not immediately understanding what was happening. "I didn't do anything, father. I was sleeping on the other side of the property. Several people can confirm it." But Norberto, blinded by the pain of seeing generations of work turn to ashes before his eyes, and pressured by the desperation of losing practically all the income of that year, did not want to hear explanations. Rage and despair spoke louder than any reason in that instant. "You are no longer my son," said the father, his voice dry, cutting the air like a knife. "Get out of my sight before I do something I'll regret for the rest of my life." The words fell on Ezequiel like a second fire. This one, invisible, but even more destructive than the first. He looked at his brother, hoping he would tell the truth, hoping that the bond built over so many years would speak louder than fear. But Adao lowered his eyes, unable to face his brother, unable to undo the lie that had already taken on a life of its own in front of their father. Ezequiel did not argue anymore. He swallowed the pain and only nodded, like someone accepting a sentence he already knows is unjust, but has no strength to fight in that moment of chaos. He went to his room, gathered the few things he owned into a suitcase, and left still that same morning, without a goodbye, without anyone standing up to defend him in front of his father. He walked 4 hours along the dirt road, not knowing exactly where to go, his heart heavier than his tired feet. It was at dusk, already exhausted and without a clear direction, that he stopped at a small neighboring property belonging to Donna Zulmira, a widowed farmer who had known the family by sight for years. She found him sitting in the shade of a mango tree. Isgasa lost and recognized from afar Norberto's son. She was surprised to see him there, alone and visibly shaken. "Young man, what happened?" "Aren't you Ezequiel from Mr. Norberto's farm?" At first, he didn't want to tell. He was ashamed, afraid that she would also believe the accusation. But Donna Zulmira had a calm way of asking that invited trust, and little by little, the young man told everything. Between the anger and the pain, he still couldn't process properly. She remained silent for a moment, observing his face, the way he told the story without trying to defend himself too much, without exaggerating, just with the sincere pain of someone who was unjustly wronged by those who should have trusted him the most. "You have the face of someone who didn't do what they say you did," she said finally. "If you want, you can stay here for a while, helping me with the crops, until you sort out your life. A hard-working man like you won't be helpless for long." And so Ezequiel started over, far from the family name, far from the brother who betrayed him in a moment of weakness, but close to a woman who never doubted him. He worked on Donna Zulmira's property, putting into practice everything he had learned on his own over the years. And little by little, he expanded her small production with the modern techniques he had always wanted to apply on his own family's farm. He kept a silent promise inside his chest, made to himself on nights of longing for his own family, even after everything that had happened. One day he would return, not to demand, not to take revenge, but to prove, with actions and not with words, who he had always been. The Valley of the Palms had changed little in 2 decades, at least in appearance. The adobe houses were still there. The same red dirt paths cut through the landscape between the plantations, and the small church in the center of the village still rang its bells on Sundays, calling the residents to mass. But behind this appearance of continuity, much had transformed, and not all for the better. Norberto's farm, once an example of prosperity throughout the region, had withered along with its owner, without the eldest son to do the heavy work by his side, and with Ada more interested in gambling circles and conversations in the neighboring town than in the crops. The property gradually lost strength, year after year. The rains had become scarce in recent times, punishing the entire region with a drought that had already been dragging on for 3 years. And the debts grew, along with the plants that withered without enough water. The name that had once been synonymous with respect in the region now only earned looks of pity from the neighbors. Norberto, aged before his time by the weight of the regret he had never had the courage to express out loud, lived isolated on the property, going out little, speaking even less. The guilt of having expelled his own son over an accusation that was never properly investigated corroded him inside for 20 years. But the pride, as strong as the guilt, prevented him from going out in search of reconciliation. Ada, for his part, carried his own burden. He knew, deep in his heart, that the lie told years earlier had destroyed his brother's life and, in a way, also his own family. He had tried, over the years, to find the courage to tell the truth to his father, but every attempt ran into the fear of being the next one expelled, the next one to lose everything. The weight of the lie followed him like a shadow, turning him into a restless man, unable to find peace either at work or in his own home. It was in this scenario of dry land and closed hearts that an agronomist engineer arrived in the valley, hired by the local city hall to study ways to recover the plantations devastated by the drought. A middle-aged man with calm speech and hands that still remembered years of direct labor on the land introduced himself to the residents only as Ezequiel, technician sent to help with the recovery of the crops. No one in the valley immediately recognized the young man who had been expelled 2 decades earlier. Time had changed his face, broadened his shoulders, and the pain experienced over the years had changed his way of looking at the world. Firmer, more silent, but without the resentment that many would expect to find in a man who had been so unjustly wronged. Ezequiel spent the first few days visiting property after property, teaching simple irrigation techniques that saved water, testing the soil to understand where there was still hope of recovery, and gradually restoring the confidence of farmers who no longer believed in another abundant harvest. He worked with patience, without haste, explaining each step with the clarity of someone who truly cared about the result, not just the fulfillment of a task. His reputation grew quickly among the residents. They said that the technician sent by the city hall had a way with the land like few others, almost as if he knew that soil from another life. And, in a way, he did. When it was time to visit Norberto's farm, now a shadow of what it had been before, Ezequiel stopped in front of the gate for a long minute before gathering the courage to enter. His heart beat strongly, not out of fear, but from the strange mixture of memories that the place awakened. Every tree, every curve of the path, brought back memories he had kept very deep for 20 years. It was Lucia, daughter of an old neighbor, and now a teacher at the small village school, who recognized him first. She had gone to Norberto's farm that day to deliver a message about a community meeting, and crossed paths just as the technician approached the gate. She stopped suddenly, eyes wide, examining that face that seemed impossibly familiar. Ezequiel. Ezequiel? Is that really you? He turned slowly, recognizing in that voice the distant echoes of the past. Lucia had been his childhood friend, the young woman who had always believed in him, the only one, besides Donna Zulmira, who had refused to believe the accusation when the rest of the valley had chosen convenient silence. Lucia, he said, a contained smile appearing for the first time in days. I didn't think I'd find you here right away. The two exchanged a look that carried 20 years of unspoken longing, of unanswered questions, of a past that both knew still needed to be faced. There was no time for more words between them at that moment, because it was then that Norberto, alerted by Lucia's voice, came out of the veranda with uncertain steps, leaning on the doorframe. He recognized his son even before he could see his face completely. He recognized it in the way of walking, inherited from the boy's own mother, in that bearing that not even 20 years of absence had managed to erase. Son was the only word he managed to pronounce. His voice cracked like land without rain for months. Ezequiel did not run to hug him. He remained standing where he was, his heart in conflict between the old pain, still alive in some corner of his chest, and the sincere desire to, finally, after so much time, be seen by his father for what he had always been, an innocent son, wronged by someone else's fear. I came to help with the crops, Mr. Norberto, he said, with a serenity that hid the storm of feelings inside. You need new water in this land, and it needs truth too, before anything else. Norberto lowered his head before those words, feeling the weight of each one. He didn't know how to respond immediately. 20 years of silence are not undone easily, even when the heart is already tired of carrying its own mistake. The news that the technician sent by the city hall was, in fact, Norberto's expelled son spread throughout the valley in just a few days, passing from house to house like the wind that carries the seeds of a plantation to another. Some judged in low voices, remembering the old story of the fire. Others remained silent, preferring to wait and see what would happen when father and son finally met face to face, without the 20 years of silence as a barrier between them. Ezequiel, however, did not let the comments of others divert him from the reason why he had returned. He continued his work on his father's farm with the same dedication he gave to the other properties in the valley, testing the soil, planning a new rainwater collection system, teaching techniques that could bring life back to that land so punished by years of abandonment and drought. It was during one of those work afternoons, with the sun already setting on the horizon and painting the sky orange over the rows of coffee, that Ada finally gathered the courage to seek out his brother. He found him alone, measuring the soil moisture at the edge of the plantation, focused on the work, and stood a few steps away, unable for a moment to say what he had needed to say for 2 decades. Ezequiel noticed his brother's presence and rose slowly, wiping his dirt-stained hands on his pants. The two looked at each other in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch much longer than it really lasted. "I need to talk to you," Adao said finally. His voice choked, almost the same insecure voice from 20 years before. "It's been a long time since I should have said this." Ezequiel just nodded, waiting, without pressuring, without making the path easier for his brother. He knew, in some way, that this moment needed to come of Adao's own will, not by demand. "I lied, Ezequiel," the brother continued, his eyes watery, his voice failing between the words. "I had gotten myself into a debt that I hid from father, and that night I went to the barn to try to fix things secretly. It was me who knocked over the lantern near the harvest. When the fire started, I panicked. I was afraid that father would discover the debt and what I had done, and I'd let him believe it was you. I was young and cowardly, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I destroyed your life out of fear of facing my own choices." Ezequiel remained silent for an instant that seemed to last all those years on the road, of hard work on Donna Zulmira's property, of nights without family gathered at the table. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried no hatred. It carried the weight of someone who had already decided, long ago, that carrying resentment was too heavy a burden to carry through life. "I know, Adon. I found out a long time ago, through people who were also nearby that night. I never had the courage to speak. I spent years trying to understand why you did it, and it took time, but I understood. You were terrified by your own choices. That doesn't erase the pain I felt, but it helped me not to let that pain turn into poison inside me." "How did you manage not to hate us?" Adao asked. His voice choked with emotion he could no longer contain. "Because hating wouldn't bring back the years I lost," Ezequiel replied, looking at the rows of coffee stretching out in front of him. "I chose not to come back to fight. I chose to come back to build. And that's what I want to do now, with you and with father, if you want." It was in front of the whole family gathered, still that same afternoon, that the truth was finally spoken out loud, with nothing else hidden under the ashes of the past. Norberto, called by Ada to the veranda, heard the younger brother confess everything, word for word, in front of Ezequiel himself, and Lucia, who had stayed nearby after delivering the meeting message. The old farmer cried, as he had not cried since his wife's death, decades earlier. The tears flowed freely down his face, marked by the sun and time, as he approached his eldest son, trembling hands, asking forgiveness for the mistake he had carried in silence for so long. "I should have believed in you," he said, his voice broken between sobs. "I should have sought the truth before turning my back on you like that. I was a coward, I chose anger because it was easier than facing doubt. You can redeem yourself now, father," Ezequiel replied, helping the old man sit on a bench on the veranda, his voice soft but firm. "The land is still here, waiting. And I am here too. I never stopped being your son, even when you thought I did." In the months that followed, Ezequiel led the complete recovery of the family's crops and, little by little, of a good part of the neighboring properties also punished by the drought. He brought new irrigation techniques, taught the neighbors to capture and store rainwater more efficiently, and returned to the land of the Valley of the Palms, the life that seemed lost forever. The harvest bloomed again, abundant as had not been seen in years, and with it came the confidence of an entire people who began to see. In that man's story, the living proof that truth, even if delayed, still has enough strength to rebuild what a lie once destroyed. Ezequiel and Lucia, who had never stopped looking at each other with the same affection preserved since their youth, gradually rekindled the bonds interrupted by time and distance. What had begun as an old friendship transformed, naturally, into something deeper. And the two got married in a simple celebration. Under the coffee plants that returned to bear fruit thanks to Ezequiel's tireless work, the entire valley community attended, celebrating not only the couple's union, but the reunion of a family that many had already given up as permanently separated. Ada, finally free from the weight he had carried for years, became his brother's right-hand man in managing the farm. He learned, by Ezequiel's side, the true value of work on the land and honesty in one's own choices. And the two rebuilt, day after day, not only the family property, but the relationship that the cowardice of one night had almost destroyed forever. Norberto lived long enough to see his grandchildren playing among the rows of coffee that he himself had planted decades before, running freely through the land that was finally prospering again. On afternoons of weak sun, he would sit on the veranda watching his eldest son work, and felt, for the first time in many years, a peace he thought he had lost forever. Before departing, already quite elderly, he called Ezequiel close to him and said the words he should have said 20 years earlier. "You have always been my pride. I just took too long to say it out loud. Thank you for not letting my injustice become yours as well." He eased his father's wrinkled hand, feeling, finally, that ancient wound had found its rest. This story shows us that injustice can even silence a voice for a while, can even drive an entire family apart for 20 long years. But it rarely erases the truth forever. Ezequiel could have returned full of resentment, demanding every lost year, every moment of life built far from home. But he chose to return as a builder, not as a judge. And it was exactly that choice, made even in the face of an enormous injustice, that opened space, decades later, for the entire family to finally heal. How many times do we carry grudges that are not even ours to resolve alone? How many families are lost forever because no one had the courage to seek the truth before pointing the finger at the closest one? Ezequiel's story reminds us that forgiveness does not erase what happened, does not return the lost time, but is, many times, the only path capable of planting something new and true over the ashes of the past. And you, have you ever had to forgive someone who hurt you deeply to be able to move forward? Or were you the one who needed to ask for forgiveness, too late, but still in time to rebuild what seemed lost? If this story touched your heart, leave your comment below telling which part moved you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Here we always come back to tell one more.